The Enlightened Work podcast is brought to you by Culture QI, the Culture and Talent Activation Company. With music by Geek Chorus. This episode is produced and edited by Alex Olson. For more content and engagement, follow the Enlightened Work podcast on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok.
Welcome back, Enlightened Leaders. Meena and I are so happy to reunite for part 2 of EQ, or emotional intelligence, as a top 10 enlightened leadership behavior on our power list of ELBs. In our last episode, we dug into the first 2 components of EQ, self-awareness and self-regulation. Today, we're going to focus on the other 3 components of EQ, empathy, social awareness, and motivation. Meena, I believe in our second episode, when we talked about our first ELB, desire to make an impact, you shared that your personal why statement is to cultivate empathy in all environments. You went so far, I think, as to say empathy is a fundamental human trait, albeit latent in some, which binds us together. What exactly did you mean by that?
I'm glad you asked. What I meant by that is our desire to understand each other on some basic level is what I think allows society and communities to function. When we stop seeing our colleagues, neighbors, and maybe even strangers as humans who have the same feelings and same emotions that we have, we are no longer an evolved or an enlightened society. That's plain and simple what I meant.
And I couldn't agree more. I think empathy is what keeps us from acting like irrational feral beasts entirely driven by our amygdala and survival instincts. And frankly, it's also what separates us from these oncoming AI bots, right? With that said, I think empathy is not uniquely human. And I want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the passing of a great humanitarian in Dr. Jane Goodall. Not only was Jane a living example of enlightened leadership, she extensively documented empathetic behavior in chimpanzees, which really helped revolutionize the scientific understanding of animal emotions. She and other primatologists proved the evolutionary significance of empathy for humans and in other species. And they really helped us understand that traits such as empathy, compassion, and altruism were not only essential for our survival as a species, but they are essential for our ongoing evolution on this planet.
You know, I'm so glad you are talking about her. And she actually passed while she was on a work trip. I mean, may her memory be a blessing. So thank you for that. Changing gears a bit, anyone who knows me, I am very hesitant to repeat fake news, even for the sake of refuting it. But I'm going to ask you to take me down this road. There is a very narrow band of people who have made unenlightened claims about empathy being toxic, dangerous, a fundamental weakness in humans.
I mean, it's baffling to me that these types of things are being said out there, and it is wild propaganda in my mind, because they are trying to steer people away from expressing this very basic human trait. And I think those that are demeaning empathy are doing it for either clickbait or just because it makes a good soundbite. But they definitely don't understand the several kinds of empathy, which we're going to get into. And I think, fortunately, there is just far more behavioral and neurological science about how our brain responds to and develops empathy from our childhood that fully support empathy as a critical foundation of healthy organizations, healthy relationships, and frankly, healthy societies.
And therefore, empathy belongs in the workplace. Thank you for that. There's a good reason why empathy is described as a cornerstone of strong leadership in organizational development research. This research is coming out of Harvard and Wharton and basically every organizational development thinker on the planet. The one who I've really been following, and I think he is considered one of the most renowned researchers on empathy, is Dr. Jamil Zaki, who is a professor of psychology at Stanford. His research distinguishes between three types of empathy: emotional empathy, cognitive empathy, and empathetic concern or compassion. Probably the best way to picture this or understand this is to imagine you're having lunch with a colleague. And this happens to be a pet peeve of mine. They get a phone call and they, let's say they say, this is, my mom, or this is I have to take this. You don't really know what's going to happen. But at some point during the call, your colleague begins to cry. So here's what happens to you. If you find yourself feeling bad and taking on their feelings, that is an example of emotional empathy, kind of the vicarious sharing of what someone else is going through. And chances are, the closer you are to this person, the stronger the emotional empathy will be. There are people, actually, I'm like this, I'm an empath, so I basically feel what somebody else is feeling. I don't want to gross anybody out here. There are sympathy vomiters. I'm a sympathy crier. If I see anybody, a stranger, a best friend, someone I've never met before, probably even someone I don't like crying, I will start to cry too. I just basically can't help myself. So that is an extreme example of emotional empathy. But now let's go back to the phone call. You're still sitting at lunch. You're trying, and now you're going, let me try to figure out, I see that they're sad, but what is going on? Like, why are they feeling this? What's happening? That's called cognitive empathy, trying to really understand what they're feeling and why. So you haven't heard the other side of the conversation. You're only hearing and seeing one thing. Now, the third kind of empathy would be, assuming you have a positive relationship with this person, you probably care about what they're going through and wish for them to feel better. More importantly, the most important piece is what kind of action you're thinking in your head. What kind of action can I take to help? We call that empathetic concern or compassion. So that third kind is when you're thinking, what can I do? What kind of proactive steps can I take to help the person feel better?
All right, that makes sense. How about if you have absolutely no reaction whatsoever? Like make an appointment with the doctor or something?
Yes, it might be a sign that something is off neurologically. That's absolutely right. So when the word empathy is used by itself, people usually think immediately of emotional empathy. And that makes sense, I think, because emotional empathy is a mechanism of what we call resonance, which happens biologically when we replicate feelings from one person to another. We literally feel the emotion that person is experiencing, just as I said when I start to cry when I see somebody crying. That connection, though, builds trust and understanding, because when you feel that feeling and the person sees that you're feeling that feeling, that person feels very seen and very heard.
Yep.
Now, caveats. Too much emotional empathy can cause burnout and change our behavior, as noted in Kim Scott's term, ruinous empathy. I love that term. This is the person who wrote Radical Candor, just to give you some context. Now, when ruinous empathy occurs, we are so affected that we defer or smooth out any feedback, we dumb down our message, or we may avoid a course of action entirely.
So let me check my understanding on the things that you've taught here, and let me see if I've got it right. So emotional empathy is a natural first response that we can have, and it's common because emotions are contagious. But when we have too much emotional empathy, that can be problematic, especially in the workplace.
You got it exactly right. You're absolutely right. And to some degree, I think that this to tie back, I think that this fake news is only thinking and only understanding emotional empathy, and labeling it. The good news is that we have two other kinds of empathy that enlightened leaders can, should, and do lean into. Cognitive empathy, rather than causing us to feel the emotions of others, is actually seeks to understand what's driving someone else's heart and mind. It's sort of like detective work, rather than being a close confidant. This kind of cognitive empathy is very, very helpful when we have lived experiences that are different from each other, right? So, and then the last one, this other final one, is compassionate empathy. That's driven by a motivation to improve someone else's well-being, a mission to accomplish rather than a feeling to resolve. And I really think that these two different kinds are the kind that are going to be a core strength for leaders to be effective.
And I love that you've added these other two types to my understanding. It just completely expanded my EQ toolkit, right? So just to go back and make sure I understand it, if I'm solely using emotional empathy with people I'm leading, yes, it deepens our connection. But it also can get mirrored in my own feelings, which can impede my emotional regulation and therefore my decision making. So expanding my reaction to cognitive empathy encourages understanding what the other person is feeling and also why. And then compassionate empathy allows me to focus on the forward steps that we can take to move through the problem.
Bingo.
Okay.
Again, we just talked about this. Very natural to experience emotional empathy at time with your team. Supernatural. In fact, again, I would say if you don't sometimes, that's a little weird. If you really don't have any feeling like, oh my God, I feel, somebody has a loss or there's a setback on the team. I mean, to not have any emotional empathy would be a little concerning. And focusing on cognitive and compassionate empathy as a leader protects us from burnout, and keeps you emotionally regulated. So both have the same neurological impact as cognitive empathy and still act as energizers for the relationship when you're able to help your team or help somebody in your orbit through their emotions with problem solving, perspective taking, and action taking. I think that's what is really going to give certain leaders the edge, is
I love that.
understanding those emotions and then moving forward in a productive way with that person. So acknowledge and then figure out how can we move forward and how can I help?
Right. So let's put empathy into practice. So assuming we have a healthy brain, when a team member comes to us with an emotional reaction, like you suggested, or a situation, our brain is designed to mirror and mimic that feeling. But we want to stay in a place of empathy without losing our composure. And yet we also want to stay in a place of no judgment and recognize others' differences and perspectives. So some great suggestions or questions I would suggest for you listeners that you can ask to help stay in a place of cognitive and compassionate empathy are asking, do you need me to listen, offer advice, or do you need me to intervene?
Heather, I'm sorry. I think that's a great relationship question too.
Right? Not just in the workplace.
Yes.
Do you need comfort right now, or do you need solutions? What is one thing that I could do right now that wouldn't make this any worse, right? So a way to engage without just pure feeling what they're feeling, but a way to engage in the conversation that's going to help you keep in that cognitive place and or compassionate empathy place, still have the connection with someone else, but just further the conversation. So I think those are some quick suggestions to help encourage the conversation.
I agree. And when we started this podcast, one of our big themes and thoughts was that this isn't whether or not you have a title of leader or whether you're working in a big corporate environment or in a two-person household. This just reminds me that so much of what we talk about is so relevant to all parts of your life. Those three prompts are like straight out of couples counseling, literally. So I love it. It's so good. But back to leaders. Um, I think the leaders can offer support, advocacy, advice, escalation, and there's a. I think a lot of leaders feel this like this need or this desire to always jump to the answer, and that's just not, you just don't have to do it. It's a great idea to ask what others need from you before jumping to conclusions and solutions. When we get this right, the other person feels so heard and so seen and validated that it instantly strengthens the bond and the relationship.
Yeah.
I'd really love for you to share the deeper story of your why statement. When you were working for a large healthcare IT company, your why statement ended up being care enough to show up for funerals. And I'll be honest, the first time I heard that, I was kind of taken aback.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful example of compassionate empathy in the workplace, and I'd love for you to share how that came about.
Yeah, I think we hit on it briefly in episode 2. So yes, I was a executive leader at a very large healthcare IT corporation. This was back in, I think, maybe 2013. And I was in charge of driving a massive transformation in an organization that unfortunately had very little trust or alignment between leaders and the teams that they were trying to lead, which of course made my job a little bit complicated and challenging. During this time period, just on a personal note, I was raising 2 young kids. My father had experienced and was recovering from a severe stroke that left him with aphasia and partial paralysis. And my brother was battling a rare form of cancer. So suffice to say, in addition to me having this massive professional stress, I was also carrying a lot of personal stress. And so I was new to this organization, and I did my best to try hard to build relationships with those I was supposed to influence. But everyone seemed so wrapped up in their own fears and motives and stressors and frankly FUD that it was extremely hard. And when my brother passed away during this time period, I found myself struggling with grief all alone at work with very little support from others. And a specific example is I distinctly remember just getting hit by a wave of sadness, which happens when a loved one who has passed frequently or recently. So I'm hit by this wave of sadness, and I was on the way to a meeting with my VP. And when I entered the office, although I was working to compose myself, my leader never acknowledged my pain or attempted any sort of comfort. And I know that they sensed it and had the social awareness, but they had no idea how to really display any form of empathy in that moment. So they just ignored it and proceeded with the agenda. And that is really when my why statement formed at work, because I was trying to help the culture transform. And honestly, I didn't want to work in, nor should anyone else work with people who, you're spending 50 to 60 hours a week with, and they're either don't care enough or they don't have the EQ skill set to show up for coworkers in need, for colleagues in grief, to show up to funerals, literally and figuratively. So fast forward a year later, and I found myself in the office of another VP who had recently returned from her mother's funeral. And I didn't have a close relationship with this leader, but I couldn't not acknowledge the elephant in the room. Although I had an agenda for the meeting, I opened by acknowledging how tough it must be to return to work so fresh in her grief journey. And I wanted just to let her know that I knew intimately the pain she was experiencing, and that I was available to her as a safe place if she needed it. And I think that interaction significantly deepened the trust of our relationship. And it ended up becoming a pivotal moment for the work we would accomplish together over the next several years. So I'm grateful that I was able to recognize what wasn't happening in the environment and with certain leaders, and not only make sure my behavior was different in the interactions I had with other leaders, but really start working with that culture to allow them a place where they could be more supportive empathetically to each other. Because work is too hard, right? As is, to not have that. So here's one for you, since I shared that. What do you think happens when we don't react with any form of empathy?
Well, it's not a sign of a great leader, I would say, off the bat. But let's go with it, right? At best, you damage the relationship. And at worst, do you diminish the trust you experienced as you experienced when your brother passed away. And at worst, not showing any empathy can weaken or basically destroy your ability to be an effective leader. It is so damaging and such a key ingredient to good leadership. And we've been really nuanced in what we mean when we say empathy. So I don't want to hear like, oh, this, that anymore, since we have now parsed it out for everyone. And it's very clear what kinds of empathy are effective. Yeah. So, but back to your question, working without empathy can create division and exclusion because without empathy, you're not acknowledging the perspective and the experiences of other people. That's plain and simple.
Yep.
A striking example of the absence of empathy occurs in what's called in social science us versus them language, or what's also called in social science in-group versus out-group mentality. So that mentality ultimately reduces our ability to think critically because it moves us, to use scientific language, it moves us from the prefrontal cortex, i.e., or executive function, that's what we want and need, executive functioning, to the amygdala, which is stuck in the threat response. So if you're constantly thinking, the engineering group did this, the sales group did this, they're trying to sabotage us, the IT department isn't supporting us, or IS, that's constantly stuck in the threat response, rather than taking it up several levels and going through it in a more, it's truly called, the prefrontal cortex is where your executive functioning occurs.
Yeah.
Evidence-based research repeatedly tells us that successful leaders who cultivate empathy within their leadership style and within their teams, they end up with higher connection and cooperation, higher rates of innovation, and higher engagement. And we all know that one of the things I think enlightened leaders have and want is an engaged workforce, which means, again, more creativity, more innovation, less attrition. These are all positive things that actually don't cost anything. They're just about how you lead. And every single one of us can learn to be more empathetic.
Absolutely. So what are some ways that we can strengthen our empathy?
Ooh, my favorite part. So all of us could benefit from strengthening and, sadly, in some cases, from developing our empathy muscle. So neuroscience has proven that in humans, the empathy muscle is truly no different than our biceps, for example. We all have a bicep, but whether or not it's been exercised or toned is another matter. So to begin developing our empathy muscle, you have to have self-awareness.
Yeah, we've talked about this.
Yes, and I have a tidy list of how to develop this. So let's start. Look, number one thing is seek feedback from others. So that is not always easy, and you may ask, who? should I see from whom should I seek feedback? So this could be what I've always called your personal advisory board. My personal advisory board are maybe a couple former bosses, maybe some colleagues. My personal advisory board includes my sister, does not include my spouse. I love him with all my heart. He is not a member of my personal advisory board. My sister absolutely is. So seek feedback from this group of other people. Number 2, identify your values. Again, what's your motivation? What are your values? If you know your values and your North Star, it's going to make your life a lot easier when you're trying to develop the self-awareness.
Yep.
And of course, I love this one. Read fiction. You may ask, why does reading fiction help develop my self-awareness? The moment you open a book, a fiction book, and start reading it, you are putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So that, by its very nature, is developing self-awareness and developing empathy. I would just read fiction all day long if I could. Practice gratitude. That is number 1, 2, 3, 4. So this could be really profound things like, I am so grateful that I am healthy and that I woke up this morning. That's pretty profound. Or it could be smaller things like, I happen to be addicted to Fuji apples. And even though I'm the grocery shopper in the household, I'm always very grateful when I open the fruit bin and there's a Fuji apple in there in the morning. So it doesn't need to be, as I said, profound. It could be for the little things, but practice gratitude. It's very, very impactful in your happiness. So I like this one. I like number 5. Examine your knee-jerk emotional reaction to things. What happens, what happens in that amygdala? What are your first thoughts when you hear about something or you read about something? What is your emotional reaction? And give that a little bit of thought. And then the last, number 6, is practice mindful or guided meditation. Again, after pandemic, there are such an abundance of apps and free apps that provide those. So that's Calm, Headspace. My Peloton app has tons of mindful guided meditations. Could be as short as 5 minutes, as long as 15. But these are all incredibly helpful in terms of developing self-awareness, which I see kind of goes hand in hand with empathy.
Yeah, those are outstanding suggestions. I'm sure listeners hear a little bit of themes from our last podcast on just the first parts of emotional intelligence, because they're all interconnected, and what allows you to create self-awareness and self-regulation also lead into you deepening your empathy for others. And I think that self-awareness is just a great segue into social awareness, which is the 4th key component of EQ. So social awareness is the ability to read the room, right? See things from other people's perspectives, sense and understand the emotional needs of others, and of course, your ability to show empathy to them. And I just want to clarify for folks that social awareness is not about projecting your own stuff and telling stories.
Well,
and I
like
think
starting to cry all the time.
right.
That's actually
I think oftentimes you put yourself as the head character in a situation when you're interacting with someone else, and you let your ego and your insecurity take over the story as opposed to really focusing on what's happening with them. So social awareness is tuning in your senses to what's happening to everyone else outside of your head. And I think that's a really important point, to put the focus really on others as opposed to you.
Yeah, I love it. And what it makes me think of is that phrase, listen to understand, not just to respond. I mean, how many times, and this is probably most people, most of the time, when you're in conversation or in a heated discussion, you stop actually listening to what the person you're speaking with is saying, and all you're focusing on how is your response. So you're not understanding at all. You're just focusing on your response.
That's right. And then to go deeper in social awareness, there's a common statement. I'm sure most people have heard about it, but that 80% of all communication is nonverbal. And I think that stat is probably an oversimplification. But the point is that nonverbal cues like your body language, your facial microexpressions, your posture, your tone, they all play a very critical role in how messages are perceived. And studies indicate that when there are inconsistencies between verbal and nonverbal messages, people actually rely more on the nonverbal signals than what's coming out of someone's mouth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think social awareness is also about how it sounds, about having an awareness about what's happening in the world at large. And this becomes more and more critical as younger generations enter the workforce because they prioritize their careers as avenues for driving social change. They're also more heavily focused on making ethical impacts and seeking work environments that align with their values. I think we've seen this over and over. There were, in the last couple of years, flags in the workplaces, people not wanting to come to work for certain reasons. And to ignore, if you're a leader and you ignore those things, you're making yourself a fossil, I think. You're becoming completely irrelevant.
Agreed. And I think, to give us an example of this, for those of us who are a little older, we all remember what the day was like when 9/11 happened and what work felt like on that day and the aftermath at work. And I think the new generations in the workplace really have their own version of world events that are coming even faster through their phones, through their social media. And it's faster than we ever experienced, our generation. So as a leader, you absolutely have to be aware of this and you have to recognize it. And yes, we all need to self-regulate to be able to get work done, but to completely ignore big social events appears tone deaf and utterly unsympathetic.
Well,
you're basically proving that you're a dinosaur.
Right. Yes, I agreed. So, all of that, how do we build social awareness?
Well, I think first it's important that we be able to self-reflect, which is what we just talked a little bit about and we dug in deep in episode 3. Second, I think you just have to prioritize being present socially with others, meaning get off your phone, right? Get off your phone, make eye contact, turn on your camera if you're meeting virtually.
Oh my gosh, I'm evangelical about that.
I know, I'm going to say it loudly, but if you are meeting virtually with people and your camera is not on, you are diminishing the effectiveness of your communication and your relationship that you could be forming. Also, just stay aware of and engage in what's going on around you. Thirdly, I think practice active listening. I think the most current stat is that our attention span is something between 8 to 12 seconds because of social media. So besides, paying attention to those around you, you can show that you're listening through your nonverbal cues, nodding, paraphrasing or asking questions, things that we've tried to demonstrate today. And by all means, you've got to stop interrupting people when they're speaking to you. That is a telltale sign that you are listening to respond, not to understand. And I think fourth, really focus on observing versus reacting. So be aware of your, as well as others' tone and body language and what is maybe being said, as what is maybe being not said, as well as how things are being said. So this means not reacting in your head and making up a story, and also deferring your judgment. Because oftentimes that's the other thing that will happen is we're observing, but our head is going wild and we're creating all these judgments about the other person. So if you defer your judgment to really better understand the other person's perspective, that allows you to stay in a place of observation versus reaction. And fifth, be aware of what's happening in the world around you that could really be impacting how people feel and are able to show up at work. You don't have to share your opinion about it. In fact, sometimes as a leader, it's better that you don't, but you absolutely can acknowledge what's going on in the world around you and how that may be impacting your team's focus.
I love it. Heather, this is a great list and such excellent tips for leaders and everyone, again, everyone to remember.
Yeah. So finally, let's quickly review motivation, which is the final component of EQ. We talked about motivation a lot in our second episode. So to have strong EQ, you've got to know your motives. You got to keep them aligned to those you want to influence. So what is your motive for being a leader? Is it for power, status, and position? Is it for money? And if you want to have influence, you have to know your motivation for wanting to lead in the first place. And you have to keep them in check every day. And if you want to dig further, go ahead, go listen to episode 2, where we really dive into this component in our first ELB, Desire to Make an Impact.
So that wraps up our last episode on EQ. And as you know, there is a lot more as well. And always, we share our sources so you can dig deeper into any of these topics too.
And I think we covered it really well in our time. We're at an inflection point, I think, right now in our culture and society with the acceleration of technology and artificial intelligence, that we need to double down on the skills that make us distinctly human, like emotional intelligence. Because in the real world, outside of our offices and our computers and our devices, we still have to function in groups. We cannot function in isolation. And EQ allows us to deepen our connection with ourselves and build deeper relationships with people we work with or want to influence. It helps us prioritize listening, understanding, and collaboration, all of which help us move our teams, our organizations, and hopefully our communities forward.
To our listeners out there, thank you for learning with us, practicing EQ in the world, and for joining the Enlightened Work Uprising.
Until next time, be the good.